Very good morning to you all. Thank you for being here. Well, this is the working group chairs for the Dahrendorf Symposium. More people are arriving. Just to put this in context, in the past year, 5 Dahrendorf working groups have been analysing Europe's relationship with 5 key geopolitical regions. They've identified the main issues and examined the strategy underpinning potential policy approaches. In the course of their work, they've also brought in experts from inside and outside Europe, held more than 50 events with experts and the public, whilst producing a number of online and print publications. Now, this morning, they'll present those findings, which you'll have the opportunity to debate in more detail in 5 parallel sessions. But what they're going to give you today is a taster of each working group theme. Now, the group chairs will present a summary and a conclusion of those themes. And just to introduce the members of our chair, Cilja Harders, who's the co-chair of the working group Europe and the MENA-region. Also, Genia Kostka, who's Professor of Governance of Energy and Infrastructure at the Hertie School, Berlin. She's also co-chair of the working group Europe and China. Dilek Kurban, who's co-chair of the working group Europe and Turkey. And Peter Trubowitz, chair of the working group Europe and North America. And finally, Vladislav Zubok, chair of the working group Europe, Russia and Ukraine. Welcome to our panelists. You have 5 minutes, and I have to be strict on this, to deliver your taster to the audience. Cilja.
Are they on? It's on? Okay. So yeah, good morning. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to very briefly introduce the working group. I had the pleasure to share this together with Professor Klaus Offe of Hertie School. Now, in the Middle East, we're starting from a very complex, dynamic and uneven situation. 2011 was a watershed moment in many different directions. What did happen? Or what did it do? An opening, mobilization for freedom, more space. People were basically reclaiming the political in the sense of having a space in which social and political contradictions can be negotiated in a peaceful way. Of course, the breakdown of the social contracts and the authoritarian regimes of the Middle East, something we already talked about yesterday, is one of the main reasons for these upheavals. But what happened then, of course, and not surprisingly so, we see since then protracted and very heavy-handed power struggles between old elites and new contenders. We see a lot of new and old contradictions surfacing again between the generations, between Sunni and Shia, between Muslims and non-Muslims in the region, between the rich and the poor. So many social cleavages which have been there before, of course, but have been somehow overshadowed by authoritarian rule, came to the fore. This is a necessary result of an opening, but of course it also created a lot of conflict, a lot of contradiction, a lot of violence, which then of course also led to protracted conflict both in Yemen, in Syria, in Libya, which makes the situation even more complex, to say the least. The EU, meanwhile, this is our conclusion, is ill-equipped due to many, many reasons. One reason that there are so many internal problems, that looking at the outside seems to be more limited, the resources are more limited, and of course, as all of those of you know who have been maybe engaged in EU research projects, things tend to be a bit complicated and bureaucratic at times, and this is of course also true for foreign relations. Having said that, there is of course also good news. It's complex, but it's man-made. These wars don't come from nowhere. They're a result of historical constellations of forces and powers. And as they are man-made, we can look at reasons and we can also look at spaces of intervention. And this is what we have been doing in the working group, but from a perspective which tries to go beyond broader, let's say, the big categories. Yesterday, for example, in the voting, most of the audience was thinking that state failure is a main problem. I have to say that we would like to go beyond state failure, because really the situation in Libya is quite different from what you have in Morocco or Egypt. And the root causes of the conflict in Syria are different from what's happening at the Sinai, for example, or the Israeli-Palestinian situation. So state failure is a much too broad category to understand what is going on. And it's very clear that the region is not, I mean, there is not a political void. It's not that you might not have a government, but of course you have a lot of actors who try to govern. You have a lot of interest, a lot of resources, and a lot of contradictory agents at play, and this is important to understand. Which makes it, of course, difficult for Europe to deal with the situation, because it's not the standard intergovernmental interaction, which might be helpful here. We also want to go beyond Europe and beyond Eurocentrism. It's very important to take into consideration what other people think about Europe and how they look at Europe. We perceive of the Middle East and Europe as deeply interconnected, especially through people and through knowledge and through a shared history, of course, which is not just a shared history of the Mediterranean as a mass grave, but of course also the Mediterranean as a passageway for knowledge, people, goods, and a shared legacy. And third thing, I think we want to look beyond elites. We want to take into consideration local dynamisms, local perspectives, and the local reasons for global problems. Also because we think that this is a way of create useful strategic advice for European and maybe also Arab actors.
Cilja Harders, thank you. Can I call on our next panelist, Genia Kostka, to make your 5-minute presentation? Thank you.
Okay, I'm ready. So I have been chairing the EU-China relations working group, and our panel today will look at the topic of China's economic slowdown and how it adds trouble for Europe. And what have we discussed in the last year or two? On the one hand, we see a China that is increasingly becoming more self-confident, and it's also reaching and expanding its global reach. We see that China creates and finances parallel international structures. For example, we have heard the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. We also see that China invests large amounts into Europe. Just to give you an example, this year China pledged 5 to 10 billion euros in the infrastructure Juncker plan into Europe. This is a lot more than the largest single national pledged investment. The UK is 8.5 billion. So China investing 5 to 10 billion into Europe. That's a lot of money. How should Europe deal with it? And at the same time, we see also China is very troubled at home. We see the economy is slowing down. Last year, GDP fell by to 6.9%. So the two-digit growth we've seen is really something of the past. This year, for example, one province claimed negative growth. Liaoning in the northeast is growing negatively. This is a big shock for China, who has to create millions of jobs. So what should China do? And importantly, how does it affect Europe? China's economy has direct impact on Europe's economy, on the European companies. How are European companies prepared or not when China's economic slowdown, growth is slowing down? So these are very important questions. In our panel, we will also debate what's the source of the slowdown. Some experts say, oh, actually, that's normal, right? China is a maturing economy. It's restructuring its economy. It's rebalancing. Of course, economic growth will slow down. Other experts on our panel actually claim, well, be careful. There are actually underlying problems here. There are large debt amounts in China. We have a very volatile stock market. We have economic reforms are really stalling. The state-owned enterprises are becoming very powerful, and they hinder economic reforms. There are really some fundamental problems in the economy, and that's why we see economic slowdown. So this is a debate that's currently ongoing, and we will use the 120 minutes of our panel to delve into these issues further. We will also discuss some important decisions that are ahead in the European Union. Currently, there's a debate going on. Should China be given the market economy status? Some countries, UK, say yes, of course. Others, Italy, say no, please not, because this has implications on jobs in Europe. So there's a very tense debate, and our panelists will give us some insight on this debate. And finally, we will also look at, just looking ahead, what is the best case scenario for EU-China relations, what is the worst case scenario, and we have really 4 distinguished scholars and practitioners. This is what I call my dream team. We have some people from the European Parliament, we have business expertise, like the chief representative from BASF is there, we have the public finance expert here, and we have a political China scholar. So really, this will be 120 minutes where we can pick this brain from these 4 people, and it should be a lot of fun. So that's my 5 minutes promoting the China panel.
Excellent, thank you very much. Dilek Kurban.
Thank you, Julia. Good morning, everyone. So I'm one of the 2 co-chairs of the Turkey-Europe Working Group. My fellow co-chair is Professor Esra Özyürek. She's at LSE. She's also the chair of Contemporary Turkey Studies at the LSE. And the 3rd member of our team is Lisa Haferla, our research associate, who's somewhere here, I think. So at the beginning, when we were talking about how we wanted to approach our work under the Dahrendorf Forum, we thought of Europe as larger than the EU. And in approaching Europe and Turkey relations, we also thought of this bigger than the EU. And we really resisted approaching this in terms of EU-Turkey relations, which at the time, when we started working on this, was not going anywhere. It was really, there was not much meaning really to talk about, to repeat the same discussions around EU-Turkey relations. So we wanted to look broader, and we selected 2 themes that we wanted to look at, democracy and justice. Not only in Turkey, but also Europe's understanding of democracy and justice, the flow of European principles on democracy and justice from Europe to Turkey, and how this impacts the situation on the ground. And we also adopted a grassroots approach. We wanted to go beyond having discussions between politicians and policymakers, but really wanted to involve not only academics, but also activists and human rights advocates on the ground. After we started working, of course, things changed rapidly in unexpected ways, both in Turkey, in terms of democracy and justice in Turkey, but also in terms of Europe's relations with Turkey. From the beginning, when we talked about Europe, we were thinking of not just the EU, but the European Court of Human Rights and European norms and principles, and we really wanted to regenerate that debate about European norms. But as we see, from the discussion also yesterday, the kind of new relations between EU and Turkey around the refugee deal is, of course, not the kind of relations that we wanted to see. The kind of European involvement is not, that we see now, is not what we were envisioning. So we did 2 things really. On one hand, we continued our research on these sort of topics of democracy and justice concerning legal mobilization, political mobilization, civil and collective memory in dealing with the past, etc. But we also responded to current debates and developments at the political level. So what we did was we did a number of panel discussions on the elections in Turkey. We did a couple of workshops on the refugee deal. We brought together actually people from the ground in Turkey working with the refugees and who really know the ins and outs of the situation. And we're now in the process of writing a policy paper based on the refugee deal, sort of in a way of lessons learned, and a paper that brings together factual information and
Okay,
also
sorry,
policies.
I must interrupt because we are coming to the end of your 5-minute slot, but that's a very good roundup overview of your workshop, which takes place
Just
after.
one, can I take one
Very
sentence to
briefly,
conclude?
very
Yeah.
briefly, because I'm conscious you could be encroaching into somebody else's time.
Sure. So just to conclude, we want, from the beginning we thought we approached democracy as a substantive issue, going beyond the procedure and elections. And at the end of the day, where we are today, is that we see that even the very procedural assumptions about democracy in Turkey is at stake. So I'll be happy to respond to any questions that you may have, and we'll further discuss these questions in our panel. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you very much. Peter Trubowitz.
Why don't I just take that one? So good morning, it's good to be here with you, to have an opportunity to share some of the takeaways from the Europe and North America Working Group. In addition to me, there were 12 other members of the Working Group, so we're a pretty big group, including people from Europe, the UK, the United States. And so in a way, it's kind of hard to say, it's a big group. We didn't exactly, I think, we weren't striving for consensus, but I think there were some takeaways from our deliberations. And one of the things I think that I've taken from the deliberations is that at this historical juncture, at this moment, Europe and America's ability to work together is being really challenged as much by domestic politics as it is by international developments. Rising nationalism, widening inequality, declining trust are basically weakening the domestic foundations that have been so vital to transatlantic partnership. And I think that until now, many of us have just taken for granted. And some of that, taking it for granted, has to do with the legacies of the Cold War, the challenges of finding a new international mission in its absence. Some of it, I think, actually has to do with disciplinary boundaries in the academy that have effectively stovepiped the study of international politics and the study of domestic politics. And this is one of the things that we tried to overcome in our working group. And given our mission, we focused a lot of time and energy on the US side of the equation, and not surprisingly, this year's presidential campaign figured in pretty prominently into our discussions. And there's a number of points here to make, but the one that I want to flag and throw out there as, I guess, a teaser or maybe red meat is that America's commitment to internationalism is really being challenged domestically in ways that few would have predicted just a few years ago. What the 2016 campaign has really done is cast this in very stark relief. It's basically revealed that Americans are no longer as convinced that internationalist policies are in the country's best interest. And rightly or wrongly, many see cheap Chinese imports or illegal Mexican immigrants or, dare I say it, free-riding NATO allies as evidence that internationalist policies that once worked for America are no longer paying the same kinds of dividends. Now, this is not the first time we've heard these kinds of complaints about trade unfairness or illegal immigrants or stingy allies in presidential campaigns. And it would be a mistake, I think, to conclude that Trump and Sanders' success this year means that internationalism is like dead domestically in the United States. It's not. But it's also, I think, clear that these issues have never gained the kind of political traction with voters that they have in this electoral cycle, at least not in the modern era. Looking back on the Cold War, George Kennan once observed that the reason the United States succeeded internationally is because there was always something worse than the United States, namely the Soviet Union. And I think what we're beginning to see is that, for the first time really, is that Kennan was only half right. America's success abroad did depend on something being palpably worse but it also depended on something else, which was economic security at home. And for much of the Cold War, Americans from all walks of life, from Wall Street to Main Street, believed that the country's commitments to liberal internationalism were in their own economic self-interest. And I think that's what's no longer so self-evident to many Americans. And one question that the presidential campaign has raised is whether we have reached a tipping point. Now, my own guess, probably more a hope, is that we haven't. But I think this much is already clear to me, and I think a number of other members of my working group, that any president who wants to invest political capital in the liberal internationalist project in 2017 is going to face stiffer political odds than his or her predecessors did. In my own view, the strategic challenge facing the next president is going to be is trying to figure out how to reconcile two things: the international demand for continued U.S. leadership with America's shrinking domestic political willingness and capacity to supply it. Now, exactly how he or she does that, I mean, you know, that's hard to predict.
Okay,
But I would submit one last point, is that even if it's Trump, if it's Hillary, I don't know, I suppose there's maybe some third-party person that's out there, that they're very likely to follow in Obama's path, looking for ways to economize and prioritize in a way that just was not true 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And I'll leave it there. These are the kinds of issues that we're going to take up in our panel.
Excellent. Can we now give some time to our final panelist, Vladislav Zubok? The floor is yours.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Juliette, esteemed audience, and the Dahrendorf Symposium. Great privilege to be here and present the findings, preliminary findings of our group. We had 5 permanent members in our team, but also we withdrew on the expertise of about 30 experts, including some, I'm happy to say, from Russia and Ukraine. So what would Lord Dahrendorf say about what we defined in our panel as the Eastern stalemate? Hard to say, but I think he would look beyond obvious cliches like a new Cold War and think of it as a European problem, as a European opportunity, but also as a Ukrainian-Russian challenge. There's a temptation to view it as Russian aggression against Ukraine, as 2 separate problems. After all, Russia opposes Europe and Ukraine wants to join Europe, but in many historical ways, it is one Russian-Ukrainian challenge. Its origins, of course, in my opinion, lay in the abrupt collapse of the Soviet Union and the lasting consequences of that haunts us. First point I want to make, there's no light at the end of the tunnel. If there are expectations that economic sanctions will make Russia back down and change its behavior, they were too optimistic. And why these sanctions, that are much weaker after all than sanctions against Iran and Cuba, should work for Russia. Russia definitely is weakened by sanctions and economic recessions, but Putin retains a lot of freedom of initiative and can surprise all of us with unexpected moves. It's not clear where and what these moves will be next time. Second point I want to make is that Western response to the Eastern challenge, or Russian-Ukrainian challenge, has been ad hoc and reactive. The reflexes of the Cold War are in place. Look for placebos, very obvious solutions. Of course, the United States, as we all know, is now trying to increase, although economically, its NATO assets in Eastern Europe, beginning with the Baltics. But it was, in a sense, an old strategy that you can find in the Bush-Scowcroft administration in 1990-91. The EU strategy, quote unquote, is not a strategy at all, in my opinion, and in the opinion of some experts of the group. It is likely that Brussels will continue to pursue its policies in the East in expectations that it will have some kind of Atlantic cocoon, security cocoon, using a phrase from my LSE colleague, that NATO provided for many decades of the Cold War. It may not be so, actually, but even if it happens, the result will be another militarized and lasting conflict in Eastern Europe. Next point, it's crucial to define the Russian-Ukrainian challenge to Europe, particularly the Russian part of it. Here, we divided in the group, so I do not pretend to express the common opinion. I would stick with my own opinion that is close to what director of the center in Vienna, Ivan Krastev, in 2014 called aggressive isolationism. Russia does not want to rebuild the Soviet Union, and it cannot rebuild it. Putin reacts to what he regards as the two-pronged expansion of the West, NATO and EU. What is Ukrainian part of the challenge? Ukraine, of course, demonstrated it could be an actor on the streets of Kiev and Maidan, but in international relations, Ukraine remains a bone of contention, and ENEP actualized this fact in 2013-14. Also, as a country, not as a society, Ukraine is close, dangerously close to a definition of a failing state. It was so under Yanukovych, but not only. If Ukraine erupts or implodes, again, there may be another EU-Russia conflict over Ukraine with unpredictable outcome. Another point, instability and lack of cohesion in the European Union itself became a new and very powerful factor for both Russia and Ukraine. In Russia, the elite hopes that destabilized and divided Europe would somehow be easier to deal with. And in Ukraine, the lack of sufficient financial assistance and the growing realization that long-term strategy does not give Ukrainians an immediate respite from misery and corruption may lead to frustration and another political crisis. I don't think the global strategy in the making, European global strategy, is likely to give answers to this Russian-Ukrainian challenge. Next point, three-track policy for Europe that I put as a collective product in my memo. Let me just repeat. It's above all ending the war in East Ukraine, managing the conflict in East Ukraine, number one. Then sustaining Ukraine, keeping it afloat at least. And then the most challenging part is creating a new framework for dialogue with Russia. I guess some people say why we should have any new framework for dialogue with Russia. I would say if we don't create it, something beyond Minsk to raise the stake of Russia in a stability in the eastern neighborhood, then we risk to repeat the cycle of securitization and militarization in this part of the world.
Thank you very much to our panel for those presentations, the cell, the tasters. Now, just to give you guys a sense of what is happening next, this is where we open the floor to you. If you want to ask any questions, you can put them to our panel. Now, we can use Slido. For those of you who didn't get acquainted with Slido yesterday, let me explain. If you type sli.do.com onto your handsets, your phone handsets, you then type in the event number. The code is there, DSYM 2016. So that way you can actually put your questions to the panel. They will come up here on the screen for the panel. If you want to see the questions, there's a screen there behind you, or to the side of you, I should say. And really, that's the option for people who don't feel comfortable about using a microphone. Now, I'm not sure if there are microphones around. If not, bellow. That's the best way to do it. But you know, if you want to ask a question, please feel free to raise your hand and address it to any member of the team that you wish. Is there anybody who would like to start by asking a question to our panel? If not, I shall do. Would you like to ask a question, sir? Bit of a tussle going on there. Let me start, in fact, just picking up on the point of China. Speaking as a journalist, what tends to emerge is that the West wants to do business with China, but at the same time, we're afraid of China. We have a very ambivalent position towards the world's second biggest economy. Is that fair?
Yes, that's absolutely what we have seen. We actually looked at Chinese investment into Europe, and we've seen the investments goes a lot in the food sector, energy sector, and real estate. And we just looked at energy, and we saw there's a lot of afraidness, especially when we look at a lot of investment is done by state-owned enterprises. And there's a lot of nervousness within the European Union about how do we deal with a state-led investment. Right? It's not a fair playing level field, because these state-owned enterprises get very cheap capital, and they compete with our European companies. So there's a lot of nervousness, but it might be a little bit the wrong way to over-focus on this. We looked at the behavior of state-owned enterprises. Often they're quite similar to private enterprises, so the European Union needs to find a way on how to deal with that. And just being afraid and maybe not engaging with China is the wrong way. So you have to find a way of finding a cooperative and win-win strategy to incorporate the state-owned enterprises. And one way is first to understand them. A lot of officials in Europe, the European Union, don't even understand how state-owned enterprises function. There's a party secretary in these state-owned enterprises. What role do they play? So there's a lot of what we call a knowledge gap, and if we address that, you can much better involve and engage with these big tigers.
And in terms of the United States, do you feel perhaps that maybe that nervousness isn't there? There's a slightly more bold approach as opposed to something which is perhaps slightly hesitant from the European perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that opinion in the U.S. is divided on China too, but if you were looking at this over a period of time, I would say that, you know, there's more concern, more anxiety about China, and a feeling that the United States needs to push back a bit more. Most of it, though, focused on China's economic rise and what it means for the United States. And of course, we've seen this play itself out in the election campaign. This is really one of the things that Trump is riding hard and hitting hard. I mean, he focuses on Mexico, but China is just absorbing a lot of attention. It's kind of the poster child, in a sense, for his critique of globalization and trade. And so, yeah, I mean, maybe there's some ambivalence, but I'll tell you, there's an ad, a campaign ad that first ran in 2010 in the midterms. It's called the Chinese Professor ad. Anybody ever see that ad? You can just Google it. It's got hundreds of millions of hits. And it first ran in 2010 in the midterms, and it was so good that they ran it again in 2012 in the election. It was so good that people started to run it again in 2014. I think we'll see it again in 2016, or a version of it. And what it describes is the future, about 25 years from now, where the United States is working for China. And it's a vision of the future that kind of taps anxieties in the United States.
Okay, a question from the audience. There's somebody back there. Yes, please, could you introduce yourself? There are microphones, excellent. Can you introduce yourself, please, and keep your question brief?
Yes, hello, my name is Anne-Sophie Gast. I have a question to Vladislav Zubok. You just mentioned the necessity to create a new dialogue forum with Russia that goes beyond Minsk and other existing dialogue fora. And I just wanted to know whether you could briefly elaborate on how this dialogue forum should look like and whom you would include in that forum. Thank you.
So what should the new dialogue with Russia look like?
Well, it's really the most difficult question that we tacked, indeed. The best we could come up with was that some kind of collective entity should talk to another collective entity. So Eurasian Union, that was entirely dismissed by the EU in 2013-14, and that really created, that contributed to Mr. Putin's anger. That Eurasian Union is now more a phantom than it actually was in 2014, but for the purpose of creating a forum. It might be actually resurrected in everybody's interest. It might be probably a good thing to treat it as if it is in actuality or potentiality, in order to assuage Russia's anxieties and sort of avoid the impression that Russia faces everyone else. Of course, Russia, to an extent, is culpable of this situation, but that's the only thing. Also, in terms of conflict in Donetsk and Luhansk, some persistence and pushing for OSCE as a mediating force, as some neutral, more or less neutral force that can be introduced into this area, I think is worth considering.
Okay, can we bring a microphone round to the front, please? Because this gentleman raised his hand very discreetly. Helmut Anheier.
Thank you. Helmut Anheier. Last night in the panel, many claimed globalization as the culprit that puts states on the defensive, and they seem unable to cope with the forces of economic globalization largely. Now, it's a question to Peter and Genia. You must have discussed TTIP, and you must have discussed the Pacific Trade Agreement. With the election coming up, do you see both agreements being derailed? And if so, what happens?
So what happens to TTIP? Will these agreements be derailed?
I'll go first. Yeah, we discussed it in our group. We had some heated discussions, I think, about trade and how strong kind of protectionist, how durable protectionist sentiment in the United States would prove to be. On this question of TPP and TTIP, well, look, if Obama's going to try to get TPP through the lame duck, right, after the election. But his ability to do that, in a sense, really depends upon the outcome. I mean, the irony here is that Republicans have traditionally supported free trade very strongly, but they're now deeply divided over the question of trade. And so Obama's ability to deliver depends not on his own party. I mean, he's got to be able to pull some Democrats, but really to be able to pull Republicans. Now, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that Hillary wins, but she wins ugly and it's close. That's going to be very hard, you know. I think that will still be very hard for Republicans to make that kind of move. If Trump wins, I mean, you know, it seems very difficult to imagine that gets through. TTIP, if an agreement is signed, and, you know, a lot of talk about how it'll be signed in the fall, also during the lame duck, basically, and that it would be for Hillary, let's say, if she gets elected, to take it forward. From my own perspective, just so much of this depends on the size of her victory, because if she comes in and it's, you know, it's relatively close, I just don't see her investing her political capital in TTIP. I think her political advisors would advise against it. That's not saying that's where the State Department would be, Treasury, you know, the rest of it. Her political consigliaries would be advising her to use her political capital differently, and if she doesn't do it in the first year, we're probably looking at that being pushed off to the second term. In other words, she would probably do what Obama did with TPP, which is push it out as far as he could, right, to the last 2 years of his presidency, and then take it then, right? When he's going for legacy and he doesn't really have to worry about re-election. Well, he didn't think he did. In a sense, he's running for a third term.
I think there was a second.
I don't know who.
Yeah, I think it's very similar here, and in our group, we focused especially on the EU-China investment agreement that's negotiated. And here we just debated, it was negotiated, like the negotiations are ongoing, and in January there was like really, both China and the European Union had very tough negotiations. And so I think these trade issues are really at the heart, and a lot is now discussed on certain words, and there is really an ongoing conflict. So it's not, many issues are not solved yet.
Okay, the gentleman here and the lady behind. Can we have some microphones, please? Are the microphones? Oh, we're going to share the microphone. Don't throw it. I thought you were about to throw the microphone.
Thank you very much. My name is Rainer Stinner. I have a question with regard to China's relation to Europe and the United States. If I look at how US and Europe deal with China, I see a different approach. In short, I would say the US approach is more or less containment, and the European approach is more or less cooperation. do you see the upcoming conflict between Europe and the United States with regard to the real approach? And do you see any chance that Europe and the United States could come together to develop a joint and common approach how to deal with China? And I go far beyond economic and trade relations. I see primarily the political situation there with regard to China.
Okay, who'd like to take that question?
Maybe I can start. Your question assumes there's one unified opinion within the European Union, and even that we don't achieve. I mean, we have, let's just take the example, right now the debate, should China be granted market economy status? Within the European Union, there's really not one unified opinion, and there's no European unified, coherent and clear strategy towards China. So, I mean, Europe doesn't manage, so I'm curious what my counterparts here think, but it will be difficult to really have the US and Europe pull on one string if the European Union is not very clear themselves what they want. So we see it with market economy status questions, we see it with investments, and the reason is within Europe the countries are very diverse. Italy has a very different interest than the UK, and we have that problem since a decade, and it's actually one of those things we want to discuss in our panel today is, so why, what's the reason that we still lack a unified answer in Europe? And how do we get there? What institutional structure do we need? So I'm a little bit skeptical that we will have also on political dimensions a same answer with the US and Europe on this very important question. And I see a more continued bilateral deals. That's, of course, better interest for China also, right? They're very clever, and I don't see that really there will be a US-EU alliance here, if that is what you're hoping for.
Okay, there's a lady who is sitting behind that gentleman. If I can have your question, please. If you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Yole Hui from the EU Center in Singapore. I have a question for the co-chair on EU-China. I understand, of course, that EU-China relations itself is already complex and you have to deal with it. But in talking about this EU-China, I'm wondering whether your group actually also discussed how China relates to the other Asian countries, because you're talking about the increasing assertiveness of China, and increasingly China and EU are going to be competitors, whether in the Southeast Asian region, in ASEAN, and how would you deal with issues like China's position on the South China Sea, and how EU react to some of these interrelated issues. So my question is really, when you deal with EU-China, you cannot forget the other countries in Asia, particularly ASEAN, Japan, and Korea, and how you're going to deal, for instance, in trying to so-called assert your interests, and when you're competing with China on some of these issues.
Right, so it's the EU in the South China area handling the issues in relation to China.
That's a very good question. I mean, I totally agree. You cannot ignore the other Asian countries surrounded. I mean, we looked at economic issues, and there we really saw if GDP declines, for example, by 1% in China, that immediately impacts all the other Asian countries by 0.7%. So, of course, there's always spillover now. And so it would be a mistake just to look at EU-China. I think you have to also look at the broader perspective. So that's definitely something that is something that needs to be done.
Okay, I want to bring in some questions that have been coming through from Slido, and I want to open this up to everybody, so I'd like to get your response. One of the questions here for all groups: if the United States is receding in its leadership role, can Europe step up to the challenge and fill the vacuum? So should we start from that end of the panel? What's your response to that question? Can Europe fill the role, the vacuum in diplomacy, leadership, if the United States effectively vacates it? From a Turkish perspective.
Well, I'll try to address that from Turkey. Sorry. I mean, if we look at let's take the refugee deal, right? At the moment. Now, first of all, I mean, it goes back to what Genia said earlier. It seems like it seems like really the relations are between Germany and Turkey at the moment. You don't see much of the EU or other EU member states. There's the EU Commission and there's Chancellor Merkel dealing with Turkey. So to what extent this is really European engagement is is questionable. But then when you look at the way in which these relations are being construed with Turkey and compare it with the US's past and current engagement, you don't see much difference in a way, actually, because both are very much based on interest. Geostrategic interest of Germany at the moment and Europe, you could say, and the US in the region. We see less and less sort of a normative, as principle-based, a democratically grounded engagement on the part of Europe, which looks terribly familiar to the way in which the US has engaged in the Middle East and in Turkey. And in that sense, it's really a disappointment. I feel that EU, in the leadership of Chancellor Merkel and the Commission, is moving even more and more away from its sort of the principles it stands to stand for, and looks like the US, actually.
Okay, thank you very much. Cilja.
Yeah, I think I very much agree to that. I think that the EU, especially after 9/11, had a lot of soft and normative power, and at least the Arab policymakers I could speak to were very eager to see more EU involvement, because they felt that it could be less pushy, dominant, and geostrategically or economically self-interested. I think the last couple of years led to a great disappointment, especially a gap or a hypocrisy between the normative, let's say, the normative habitus and the practical policies on the ground, which didn't speak to that a lot. On the other hand, of course, from an Arab perspective, European involvement is also a bit ambivalent, because France and Britain have been major colonial powers, Italy too. So there's, of course, also a Arab-European history of dominance, exploitation, and violence. And so this is also not entirely simple. From the European perspective, I think even if the Europeans wish to do so, I don't think then that they're in a situation to really replace the US, and there might have been, let's say, a time, a historical phase in which that would have been possible. The last couple, let's say, since from 99 to let's say maybe 9/11 and the 2005. But as I said, the capital which was there is lost somehow. The institutional setup, the lack of unity and all of that has already been mentioned. And so I think what we come up is that there is a vacuum, but then maybe not so much, because the Gulf states are already there, China is already there, Russia has a strategy. So maybe it's not so much a deal between the US and the Americans, but there are already so many other actors that it's not only our choice, so to say, who will play a role.
Okay, so from the American perspective, in response to this question.
Sure, I'll take your mic. Well, this is the $60,000 question, isn't it? So, if you think about this in terms of hard power, that is Europe making up for, let's say, some diminution of American hard power, count me as skeptical, and only slightly less when it comes to normative power. And the reason is because I think, and this is in our 2-page teaser that's up on the website, because many of the same things that are affecting the United States, and it was kind of implied in Helmut's question, I think, are affecting Europe too. And there's a question, it seems to me, about European capacity to act purposefully, coherently, consistently. And so, that's the big question. But you really want to come to our panel, because I've got a great lineup of people who are ready to answer that question.
That does sound like an abrogation of
How can we compete with marketing, the American marketing
It is very slick marketing, very slick marketing. But let's get the Russian perspective to that question. Can you outmarket him?
You mean the question that is highlighted?
The question is, if the US is receding in its leadership role, can Europe step up to the challenge and fill the vacuum?
From the Russian perspective, clearly no. Because you just need to read one document, a review of global European strategy, to realize the language of this document is clearly unstrategic. And indeed, I wanted to say it in answering my question later on by, the question from Marina, norms or realpolitik. There's reality, and reality should be dealt in some way. Norms, sometimes it's a very good thing to have norms, but sometimes norms just don't help to deal with the reality. And Europe cannot wake up to this.
Okay, and that question from Marina was, why should the EU compromise its values in pursuing a realpolitik approach to Russia? So we had a two-in-one answer there. I'd like to take a question from the floor. There's a lady here. Have you got a microphone? The microphone is on its way. Here it is. Excellent. Could you introduce yourself and keep your question brief, please?
Helena Kristilova, University of Kent, also member of the EU-Russia working group here. Just a quick question in the follow-up of this particular question, and also to address our discussion today and especially yesterday. It looks like increasingly what we are observing is this substantial shift from, let's say, multipolar world that used to be out there before, so sort of this constellation of power centers or configuration of power centers that could exercise some leadership and exert certain influence around the world, to actually a multi-order world with the emergent islands of power or different actors, whether we are willing them to be there to engage with or not. So, and then the question is, in this changing world with the shift of power and so on, and also the shrinking capacity of the US, in your words, to engage and to take leadership, and also, yet again, in your own words, Europe's limited capacity to act cohesively. Who is there going to be dealing with this multi-order world? And who is actually going to strategize about how to deal with these emergent islands of power in different parts of the world?
That is a big question. I'm not going to answer it, but you guys are. Who wants to go first, or shall I select a victim? Who would like to go first? What's the Turkish perspective on that question? Who's going to lead this new world order, this changing strategy?
I mean, well, indeed, it is, sorry, it is indeed a multipolar world, right? I mean, I think it's, it is so, and it will increasingly be so. Given the crisis, the legitimacy crisis of the international institutions and international leadership, as in the case of the UN and the Security Council, the multilateral regime is being increasingly questioned in terms of its legitimacy and capacity to address these questions. And of course, as underlined earlier, you see less and less interest in what in the great powers to be engaged in all of these worlds. I think maybe one actor that we should also think about, which we haven't talked so much in discussing realpolitik, is of course civil society and the global international civil society. It seems like it's going to be even a more sort of underlined contestation between the international global civil society and states, really, in addressing these questions. But I don't think that we will I don't think that there's a candidate to lead the world, and neither should there be, right? There should be more emphasis on really multilateralism and international cooperation, not only at the state level, but more so, and especially at the civil society level.
Okay, who else would like to attempt that? Cilja.
Yeah, if I may, I think, and thank you for making the point again very clearly. I think what we have, the situation we are in, and this, let's say, struggling to come to terms with a quite messy international setup where we have already the results of globalization, which have been diminishing traditional state power because your power has been shifting upwards, downwards, sidewards. So already there are a couple of actors, and they are there. And they're there to stay, but as but the same is true for the nation state, of course. So the US will stay important. The EU, among all the difficulties, of course, is a relevant actor. It's an economic power, as much as China is there. And already, I think, I mean, the world has seen a lot of politics without strategy. We survived that. We will survive it again. So that's, I think, this will go on. And meanwhile, you'll have a couple of other actors who will claim space. But maybe it's a more, let's say, sectorial competition of who can rule and govern what. Because you're very right, the multilateral forums are in many ways weakened, but at the same time, much of the current Syrian refugee crisis is managed by the UNHCR. And the money is going there. And civil society is active. So it's, I mean, even though you have weaker states, you might have in some sectors, stronger societies. In the Middle East, you have rising role of the Gulf in some of the issues, not in all. And this will not replace maybe even the wish for hegemonic power interventions, but others will use that space. So I think it will stay messy. It's not a vacuum, not at all. And what I think, what we have to come to grips with is this, let's say, the structural messiness, the structural concomitancy of all types of actors trying to claim all types of space with a couple of strategies which are both at the same time normative and realpolitik. And this also, of course, makes it very difficult. And so I think that's the challenge.
Okay, would anyone else like to attempt that question? Please.
Oh, very briefly, I think historically we've been spoiled by that unique period when the United States exercised such enormous hegemony because of the bipolar world and the Soviets. Peter spoke very eloquently about it. And we're seeing basically a return to the mess in a growing disorder, growing global disorder, where the list of countries and even non-countries that are challengers and free riders to the existing international system is growing. And the list of those who actually want to take responsibility for the mess is next to zero. So even if the United States walks out, that will be a sheer catastrophe, I think. This is why everyone understands it, and despite everything that we heard about American decline, everyone wants the United States to lead.
Okay, I better, is this thing working?
It should be.
Yeah, so I'm not saying the U.S. is going to walk out, and I get that, though. I go back to the point, so I'm not sure I accept the premise of the question, which is that we're deep into a multipolar world and so forth. I mean, my concern about the U.S. is not its relative international position. I concede that it's eroded some. It's its domestic capacity, right? During the Cold War, because of bipartisanship and so forth, it was like domestically, it was like a force multiplier so that the U.S. could act much more programmatically than it can today. And so I think the challenge is, I think U.S. leaders will still hear the siren call of leadership. The challenge will be of international leadership, of somehow, you know, navigating between that, the international demand, and the domestic supply or the capacity. And I think that Obama has actually laid down some very useful markers. I mean, for me, what I would look for from the U.S. on this is that there will be greater emphasis on core strategic interests and less on peripheral ones. That is, more emphasis on protecting the maritime commons, less emphasis on, let's say, democracy promotion. More attention on East Asia, less attention on the Middle East. I mean, I get it. The Middle East is like flypaper. It's very hard to get off of. But Obama has clearly tried to do that, and I think we'll see more of that. Greater emphasis on burden sharing, whether it's Hillary or it's Trump, and less on nation building.
Okay, can I jump in for one moment? Final word, please. Would you care to have the final word, Ms. Kostka, to that question?
Sure. I totally agree with what has been said. So far, we see very much an issue-driven society, a global world, where on certain issues we see certain nations or countries jumping in, or civil society. I'm also worried a bit on those topics where there's no volunteer country to take leadership. And that's a question of how do we deal with those where there's a gap. And I see it with China. They're very clear on what their core interests. The European Union can learn a lot from them. China is somehow very clear, the Communist Party, what's their core interests. And so what do we do if neither China nor the US or nor the European Union want to take leadership? And that's something that maybe we can debate in our panels, because that's the big question.
And you will have a lot to debate. Now, those panels kick off at 10:30. For those of you who want to attend the Europe, Russia and Ukraine workshop, you stay here. But for the other workshops, they're held at Axica. And there will be staff on hand to give you the ideas of the room details, etc. Now, lunch will be here in the club room, the top floor. That is at 12:30. And the next session kicks off at 2 o'clock. So, ladies and gentlemen, can you please show your appreciation to the panel, the hard sell. Very good, ladies and gentlemen.